Modern humans reached Australia by boat at least 65,000 years ago. That's before we had bows and arrows, before we had needles, before we had domesticated a single animal. We figured out ocean travel before we figured out basically anything else. Let that sink in. You probably think of the boat as a mid-tier invention, somewhere between the wheel and the watermill. Useful, sure, but not exactly the crown jewel of human ingenuity. That ranking is wrong, spectacularly wrong. The boat isn't a mid-tier invention. It might be the single most audacious thing our ancestors ever built, and almost nobody talks about how it actually happened, because honestly, we're still not entirely sure. Here's the question nobody asks, not who invented the boat, because there's no clean answer to that. The real question is this: how do you invent something you've never seen work to cross something you've never survived based on zero prior evidence that it's even possible? That's not engineering. That's faith with a paddle. And somehow, our ancestors did it not once, but over and over again on multiple continents, tens of thousands of years apart, with nothing but wood, plant fiber, and an absolutely reckless amount of confidence. Let's start with the problem, because the problem is worse than you think. Every other major human invention has a kind of dress rehearsal built into nature. You watch fire spread from a lightning strike, and eventually you learn to control it. You watch animals dig burrows, and you learn to build shelter. You watch a sharp rock cut skin, and you learn to shape tools. Nature hands you the concept. Humans just refine it. Boats don't work that way. There is no animal in the ancient world that builds a floating vessel, paddles it deliberately, and survives open water using intention rather than instinct. Sea turtles swim. Otters float on their backs. Neither of them is engineering a hull. The boat has no natural prototype. It had to be imagined into existence from nothing, which means someone, at some point, had to look at a log, or a bundle of reeds, or a hollowed-out trunk, and think, this could carry me somewhere I cannot walk to. That thought, by itself, is one of the strangest cognitive leaps in the story of our species. Now let's talk about how far back this actually goes, because it's further than almost anyone expects, and it's genuinely unsettling in the best way. There's a stretch of ocean between the islands of Southeast Asia and the island of Flores, known to biologists as the Wallace Line. It's not a small gap. Even at the narrowest crossing points, during ice ages when sea levels dropped and made some passages shorter, you're still looking at open water, multiple kilometers wide, with strong currents that no land bridge ever connected. And yet stone tools have been found on Flores dating back over 1 million years. 1 million years. That's not modern humans. That's not even early Homo sapiens. That's an earlier hominin species, quite possibly Homo erectus, crossing open water using tools and cognitive capacity we generally assume were far more primitive than ours. Nobody knows exactly how they did it. The leading theories both sound insane, and both are probably at least partly true. One theory is deliberate rafting. Early hominins bundled bamboo or driftwood together, intentionally, and pushed off into open water because they'd run out of land and needed somewhere to go. The other theory is accidental transport. A massive storm event, a tsunami, ripped up floating vegetation mats from a riverbank with animals and hominins clinging to them and swept them out to sea and eventually onto a new shore. Either way, something crossed that water. Something arrived on Flores that had no way of getting there except across the ocean. This wasn't modern humans with millennia of accumulated knowledge behind them. This was one of the earliest branches of our family tree, doing something that, on paper, should have been completely beyond them. So before we even get to Homo sapiens, before we get to fully modern brains and fully modern language, something in the human lineage had already crossed open water. Whether that first crossing was genius or accident almost doesn't matter. What matters is that it happened, it worked often enough to leave descendants, and it set a precedent that our own species would push much, much further. Let's talk about what a boat actually meant at this point in history, because it's nothing like what you're picturing. There was no shipyard, no blueprint, no metal tools, no rope in the modern sense, no sail for tens of thousands of years. The earliest watercraft were almost certainly rafts, bundles of buoyant material lashed together with plant fiber, vines, or twisted grass. Bamboo was ideal where it grew, naturally hollow, naturally buoyant, and strong enough to hold weight without collapsing. In places without bamboo, people used bundled reeds. The same basic principle you can still see today in traditional reed boats used on Lake Titicaca and parts of Africa. Technology so effective it simply never needed replacing. Eventually, someone figured out that a hollowed-out log floats better and handles better than a bundle of reeds, and the dugout canoe was born. Making one with only stone tools was brutal work. You'd burn a controlled fire along the length of a log to soften and char the wood, then scrape out the charred material with a stone adze, then burn again, then scrape again, over and over, for days, sometimes weeks, until you had a hull. This wasn't a weekend project. It was a serious investment of time and labor by people who had no guarantee the finished object would even work. And here's the detail that tends to blow people's minds. The oldest confirmed dugout canoe ever found, the Pessie canoe, discovered in the Netherlands, dates back roughly 10,000 years. But the crossing to Flores happened over 1 million years earlier, and the crossing to Australia happened tens of thousands of years before that canoe was built, which means for an enormous stretch of human history, people were crossing real, dangerous, open water using vessels so simple and so biodegradable that almost none of them survived in the archaeological record. We're not missing evidence because it didn't happen. We're missing evidence because wood and reed and vine rot and stone doesn't. The boats disappeared. The bones and tools that traveled inside them didn't. Now let's get to the crossing that genuinely should not have been possible with the technology available at the time. The journey to Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that once connected Australia and New Guinea. Around 65,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years depending on which archaeological site you trust, modern humans reached Sahul. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. Even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, when the distance between islands was as short as it would ever get, there was still open water to cross, not a narrow channel you could see across on a clear day. In some estimates, the final crossing required traveling over open ocean with no land visible on the horizon at all for potentially over 24 hours in the dark, with currents you couldn't predict and no way to know for certain there was anything on the other side. Think about what that actually requires, psychologically, not just technically. You need a vessel capable of carrying multiple people because you need a viable founding population, not just one lucky survivor. You need enough food and fresh water to survive the crossing. You need to convince other people, people with families, people with something to lose, that this is worth attempting. And you need to do all of this while staring at open water that, for all you know, goes on forever. There was no promise of land. There was no scout who'd gone ahead and returned with news. Whoever made that first successful crossing was operating on some combination of desperation, curiosity, and a level of collective nerve that's genuinely hard to comprehend from inside a climate-controlled living room. And they didn't do it once. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests multiple waves of crossing, meaning this wasn't a single miraculous fluke. It was a repeatable act. Someone figured out how to build a vessel that worked, how to provision it, how to navigate it, and then other people used that same knowledge to do it again. That's not luck. That's technology, tested and repeated. So how did they navigate a crossing like this with absolutely no instruments? The same way later, Pacific voyagers would refine over thousands of years, by reading the ocean itself as a source of information. Swell patterns carry direction. A skilled observer can feel the difference between a swell generated by distant wind and one bent and reflected by an island far over the horizon, essentially detecting land before it's visible through the rhythm of the water hitting the hull. Cloud formations behave differently over land than over open ocean. Land heats unevenly and generates distinctive cloud buildup that an experienced eye can spot from a significant distance. Birds that nest on land but feed at sea travel outward in the morning and return at dusk, and their flight direction at those specific times is essentially a compass pointing towards solid ground. None of this required writing. None of it required instruments. It required generations of accumulated, transmitted, tested observation, exactly the kind of knowledge system that let humans survive predators, winters, and darkness long before this crossing ever happened. The boat needed a body to carry it. It also needed a mind trained to read a world with no landmarks at all. By the way, if the sheer engineering audacity of ancient humans is the kind of thing that genuinely fascinates you, this channel goes even deeper into exactly this territory every week. The inventions, the near misses, the decisions that shouldn't have worked but did. Stick around for more of it. Now let's ask the question that actually matters more than the how. Why did they do this at all? Population pressure is the most obvious driver. When resources on an island or coastline get stretched thin, expansion isn't optional, it's survival. But pressure alone doesn't fully explain a crossing this extreme into water this dangerous, with a success rate that was almost certainly brutal. There's very likely a second factor sitting underneath the practical one: plain curiosity. The same drive that sent early humans into unmapped forests and across frozen plains during the Ice Age. The pull toward what's on the other side of the horizon isn't a modern trait born from atlases and airplanes. It might be one of the oldest instincts we have, older than agriculture, older than writing, arguably older than fully modern language itself. Every single boat that has ever been built since, every canoe, every trireme, every Viking longship, every container ship currently crossing the Pacific right now while you watch this, exists because someone, tens of thousands of years ago, looked at a bundle of reeds or a hollowed-out log and made a decision that had absolutely nothing rational backing it up. There was no evidence it would work. There was no manual. There was just water and the will to cross it anyway. You are, in a very direct sense, descended from people who looked at the edge of the world and decided the edge wasn't actually the end. Every migration that shaped where your ancestors ended up, every continent that got settled, traces back to that same decision made again and again by people with nothing but wood, rope made from plants, and the stubborn belief that the horizon was a suggestion, not a boundary. We think of exploration as a modern concept, something that started with the age of sail, with European ships and star charts and compasses. It's not. It started tens of thousands of years earlier, with people who had none of that, staring at open water that had never been crossed by anyone they knew and going anyway. They didn't know if the ocean had an end. They went to find out. And because they did, you exist on whatever side of whatever ocean your ancestors eventually reached. The boat wasn't just a tool. It was the first machine humans ever built specifically to bet everything on the unknown, and somehow it kept paying off.